It was clear that Iranian nomenclatura needed also a new tension with, not a war like now, but with Israel to control the situation. But wait a minute, the same goes for Israel. Remember what went on in Israel just a couple of months before October attack. Hundreds of thousands of people, mega demonstration against Netanyahu's attempt to take over Supreme Court and so on and so on. And they needed this war. That's why, here I have a tough question for you. Maybe you always know how to squeeze out, my God. You need gulag. Because, you know what? I would like just to know more. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but what goes on, as it were, behind the scenes, for example. This is confirmed. It's not paranoia. Friends from Israel, authentic anti-Zionist, played to me the audio clips. Do you know that till 2 years ago, Israel fully supported financially? I will try to give you a precise definition of a failed state. Very naive in bourgeois terms. Failed state is for me a state which no longer can reproduce itself without openly relying on illegal gangster bandit forces. Now, of course, every conservative will tell me, of course, look at Haiti, primitive state, 80% is controlled by gangs. I say, okay, but let's go on. Israel is a failed state in this sense. Look who is Ben Gvir. Are you aware that Ben Gvir, who is now, that's unimaginable irony, even Hegel would get dizzy in this. He is now responsible for security, public on the West. 20 years ago, he was condemned as a criminal by the Israeli...
Convicted, not condemned.
Convicted by the Israeli court. So settlers, I agree with you. They are basically a form of violent gangsterism which was deftly manipulated. Now it's openly supported for decades by the state of Israel. Formally, they distance themselves from it, but and so on. And I think same things you find all around. In Russia, it was similar with Wagner Group. Is that Proud Boys and so on. They are paradoxically anti-Semitic and at the same time anti-Arab, they are a nightmare, but nonetheless the state more and more tolerates them. This is for me the true problem. Another problem, I wrote a text, would you agree? So we live in a world more and more of failed states. We don't come to look for them in so-called third world. We get them here in the developed so-called West. Absolutely don't agree that Ukraine is like Israel. No, I think that first, let me say briefly something about Hamas and so on. For me, what is totally obliterated, although it was publicly demonstrated, as far as I know. I listen to the words of Smotrich and others. It is that we should always bear in mind that till, I think, 2 years ago or when, Israel financially supported Hamas because they wanted Palestinians split. So I think that in the long term, I of course condemn the criminal terrorist attack of Hamas. But in the long term, Israel needed, that's my analysis, needed this new war to create a greater Israel. It's happening now. We see it. Ethnic cleansing of Gaza, West Bank, and so on and so on. Who knows where they will stop? So I think, remember when Hamas Gaza attack was done, every interview that I gave, the first question was, let's clarify, do you condemn Hamas attack or not? Now the question should be asked, where do you stand about what is happening now in northern Gaza? If you don't absolutely condemn it, rational conversation is over. Another thing that depresses me immensely, it's the ethical decay I hope our viewers and listeners know what happened. It was, I think, about 2 months ago when in Knesset there was a debate about what happened in some camps south of Jerusalem, not far further south in Sinai, where some Israeli guards escaped in shock and rendered it public, even with some video clips, that Palestinians there are tortured in an unspeakable way. Big metal sticks with needles up their rectum and so on. You know what shocked me? I'm a pessimist. I know everybody is doing such things. But that we debate, not only we debated this publicly, but the majority in the parliament simply said this is part of our struggle against Arab terrorism. So brutal torture is publicly declared, defended. I mean, in such a situation, I prefer hypocrisy, because hypocrisy means that you are at least a little bit ashamed of what you are doing. But when struggle for Israeli self-defense becomes a publicly admitted horrible mode of torture, then it's over. I see paradoxically Hamas and Israel on the same side, because they both see war, brutal violence as the only way to solve the situation. Israel, I think, is fully aware that what it is doing now in Gaza, and for me the key is always West Bank, will give birth to new forms of anti-Semitism. But Israel accepts this because then it will be even more able to present itself as a victim of anti-Semitism and so on. So we should always bear in mind this. And you know whom I here really respect? I have a long respect for my communist time. Do you know who is Ami Ayalan, the ex-chief of Shin Bet? He said at the beginning, the only way out is to give Palestinians under our control some political freedom, dignity, autonomy, recognize them as belonging to this space. And then he even made a quite rational proposal that Marwan Barghouti, who is now in prison there, should be set free because he is for two-state solution, not openly terrorist now, and he can beat Hamas in free elections. This is our situation where, when I repeated what Ami Ayalan publicly said in a couple of interviews at the beginning of this war, I was interrupted by shouts of I support Hamas, I'm pro-terrorist, and so on and so on. Isn't this a sad time when the only one who clearly dares to say the truth are ex-leaders of Shin Bet and Mossad? Here is where we are. Everybody is against war, but like in the case of Israel, Israel is getting serious warnings, Western powers are worried, but they do nothing. They unconditionally, at the level of arms delivery and so on, support Israel. So again, the predominant logic today is a kind of a cynical disavowal. It's no longer the good old-fashioned lying, you deny the truth, because then you can at least counter-attack. The logic is, as they say in French, je sais bien mais quand même. I know very well, but. I know the situation is very serious, but listen, we will get somehow out, don't take it too seriously, and so on. I think the predominant danger today is not so much a fundamentalist, fanatical engagement, it is this cynical indifference. If you have the cynical, indifferent stance towards our situation, you are an ideal subject. I unconditionally condemn the Hamas attack on Israelis close to Gaza border without any ifs and buts. And I give Israel the right to defend itself and destroy the threat.
However, I noticed a strange thing. The moment one mentions the need to analyze the complex background of the situation, one is, as a rule, accused of supporting or justifying Hamas terrorism. Are we aware how weird this prohibition to analyze, to see the complexity is? In what society does this prohibition belong? Here, my first provocation, in a society which is, it's not here, which is structured like Waben, honeycomb. What an idiot did choose this as a light work. Do you know how Hanis live? It's the most totalitarian society you can imagine. More than 80% are women who are de facto castrated, not allowed to develop sexually, they just work. Then you have one queen who once in a lifetime has sex with 10 men, and when they have orgasm, the penises are immediately swallowed by her. No, thanks, I don't want to live in such a society. So let me go to my point. The title of a recent dialogue on anti-Semitism and BDS, Boycott, Divest and so on, in Der Spiegel was, auf Deutsch, wer Antisemit ist, bestimmt der Jude und nicht der potenzielle Antisemit. I translate. Who is an anti-Semite determines the Jew and not the potential anti-Semite. Okay, sounds logical. The victim itself should decide if it is really a victim. But does not the same also hold for Palestinians, who should be able to determine who is stealing their land and depriving them of their elementary rights? Further point, by analyzing the background, I don't mean the utter stupidity masquerading as a deep wisdom. You know that saying, an enemy is someone whose story you have not heard. Sorry, I read Hitler's Mein Kampf. I heard his story. And I love Nazism, not more, but even less. The first generation of Israeli leaders, from Ben Gurion to Moshe Dayan, I want to praise them here, spoke a totally different, honest language. They openly confessed that their claim to the land of Palestine cannot be grounded in some universal justice. A very actual example. On 29th of April 1956, there was an incident concerning Gaza. A group of Palestinians from Gaza that had crossed the border to plunder the harvest in the Nahal Oz kibbutz fields. The group then, Roy, a young Jewish member of the kibbutz who patrolled the fields, galloped towards them on his horse to chase them away. He was seized by the Palestinians, and when the United Nations returned the body, his eyes has been plucked out. Here is the reaction of Moshe Dayan. He delivered this eulogy at this killed Jew's funeral the following day. Listen to it. Let us not cast blame on the murderers today. What claim do we have against their mortal hatred of us? They have lived in the refugee camps of Gaza for the past 8 years, while right before their eyes, we have transformed the land and villages where they and their ancestors once lived into our own inheritance. End of quote. Can you even imagine a similar honest statement today? How far are we from the situation, even a complex of decades ago, when we were talking about land for peace agreement, two-state solution, or when even today's staunchest supporters of Israel were putting pressure on it not to build settlements in the West Bank? In 1994, Israel built a wall separating the West Bank from 1967 borders of Israel, thereby nonetheless recognizing West Bank as a special entity. All this now vanished into thin air. The emblem of today's Israeli government is Itamar Ben-Gvir. He entered politics by joining the youth movement of the Kach and Kahane Chai party, which was designated as a terrorist organization and outlawed by whom? By the Israeli government itself. When Ben-Gvir came of age for conscription into the IDF, he was barred from service due to his extreme right political background. And such a person, condemned by Israel itself as a racist and terrorist, is now, guess what? The Israeli Minister for National Security, who should safeguard the rule of law. Remember the great conflict that divided Israel in last months. Commenting the measures proposed by the Netanyahu government, Yuval Harari put it brutally. This is definitely a coup, a strike. Israel is on its way to become a dictatorship, end of quote. Israel was split between nationalist fundamentalists trying to abolish key features of the legal state power and the civil society members aware of this threat. With the Hamas attack, and that's what I consider a true tragedy, the crisis is over, the spirit of national unity prevailed. This is always a tragic moment when inner split is overcome against an external enemy. So perhaps the first thing to do is to clearly recognize the massive despair and confusion that can give birth to acts of evil. In short, there will be no peace in the Middle East without resolving the Palestinian question. I read this in the last days in Israeli newspapers themselves. I'm not in any way justifying it's a criminal thing. Yes, Israel has the full right but to counterattack. But don't forget this dark, obscure background, Palestinians. The second thing is that the solution is not a compromise in the filthy sense of the proper measure between the two extremes. You know, many of my friends claim this. They say, on the one hand, yes, Palestinians have the right to be a little bit anti-Semitic, look what Israel is doing to them. Or on the other hand, Israelis have the right to be a little bit violent, look what we did to them in Holocaust. I think there is nothing to understand here. One should go to the end in both directions, in the defense of the Palestinian rights, as well as in fighting anti-Semitism.
You cannot compare this terror of Hamas with what is doing on the Israeli side. Sorry.
I am not comparing. No, it's not relativism. I'm going much. Yeah, now you see what means in practice. Listen to diversity, inclusion. Yes, but this is the cancel logic. To have our way of diversity, some people, of course, must be first excluded. I'm talking about dozens of Palestinians that I know. Sorry if I explode now a little bit. If there is a person here in this room who did more to peaceful collaboration between Palestinians and Israelis, then I bow my head, but they didn't. What more can you do than this? With my friends, I co-organized in Ramallah a big meeting celebrating Walter Benjamin, a Jew. There was no problem debating it. I organized in Ramallah a cinema school together with the Jewish, of course, professor, and so on and so on. About this, you cannot compare. Of course, you cannot compare it as an act of violence. I mean, Hamas attack is absolutely ruthless, brutal, and so on and so on. But should I fall so low as to quote, with whom I agree here, Antony Blinken, American State Secretary, who said, yes, Israel has the full right to strike back, but how it does is the concern of us all. It's not just Israel against Hamas.
It's a shame on a day where people are murdered and massacred.
Where? In Gaza also.
Compare both sides and to relativize what was happening and what is
I don't relativize it. It was a horrible crime. I don't relativize it in any way. I'm just saying that to talk the way you did now immediately puts millions of Palestinians in an impossible position, which will then make anti-Semitism grow. I in no way identify or relativize what Hamas did. It was an unforgivable, brutal killing spree. Haniyeh says it clearly. It's not just about limiting Israel, it's about the annihilating the state. But the circumstances that I described in no way relativize this crime. They just make us see the background of discontent out of which such crimes, this doesn't justify them in no way, may arise. If we ignore this, if we ignore what is happening now in the West Bank, then we cannot understand the situation. I absolutely recognize fully the right of the state of Israel to exist. I'm absolutely also critical against the Palestinian Authority. For example, I think that Arafat was, in a justified way, characterized as the man who never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. It was extremely stupid for him to reject the pact with Ehud Barak government organized by Clinton.